In more than 2 decades, David Beckham has lived a life that few can fully understand, a life split into two parallel parts that are never allowed to intersect, where the person inside always has to strain to maintain the image outside, where every small mistake can become a verdict from the entire world, and where the pressure does not come from an opponent on the field, but from millions of eyes waiting for him to stumble, from the boos after the World Cup 1998 that turned him into someone his own homeland turned its back on, from the newspapers that never stopped dissecting his private life, from the moments he had to stay silent when his family faced storms, and from the obsession of never being allowed to be weak, even when inside he was almost collapsing. He learned to stay silent instead of fighting back, learned to keep moving forward even when misunderstood, and learned to accept that his life no longer belonged to himself, but to the expectations of the entire world. In that very silence, a persistent will was formed, not loud, but never extinguished, helping him survive, endure, and keep moving forward while carrying things no one could see. And it was that same man who built a career that very few players in history can match. From his early days at Manchester United, where he won 6 Premier League titles, 2 FA Cups, and the pinnacle was the historic treble in 1999, along with the UEFA Champions League, to the period wearing the Real Madrid jersey where he became part of the Galacticos generation and won the La Liga title in 2006 to 2007, then continued to open a new chapter at LA Galaxy with 2 MLS Cups and helped change the status of soccer in the United States. He also had 115 caps for the England national team and many years as captain. Once finished second in the Ballon d'Or race in 1999, won numerous individual titles, and was awarded the OBE for his contributions to sport. Not just a player, Beckham became a global icon, a name that transcended soccer, a model of discipline, resilience, and the ability to rise from pressure that not everyone can endure. Before continuing on this journey, please hit like and leave a heart as a quiet way to acknowledge the man who had to live strongly in silence for many years. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel, because the story behind David Beckham's spotlight still has many things the world has never truly seen. If one looks back at David Beckham's life from the very first days, people will not see a special child in the way the world later imagines. No spotlight, no clear signs of a future icon. Only a boy growing up in Leytonstone, London, in an ordinary working-class family, where the greatest love was not money or fame, but soccer, where evenings were not lavish parties, but matches watched on a small television, where dreams were not spoken in words, but present in every glance, every story, and especially in the way his father looked at his son, a look that contained not only love, but also expectation, an expectation so heavy that even Beckham later could not name it, because it was not pressure spoken out loud, but pressure felt, seeping gradually into every day of growing up, like something inevitable that could not be avoided. Beckham's father, Ted Beckham, was not a famous person, but he was a man who carried an intense belief in soccer, especially his love for Manchester United, a love that he passed on to his son, not through sweet words, but through strictness and standards so harsh they were cruel. He did not teach Beckham to play soccer for fun. He taught that if you play, you must play the best. If you dream, you must dream to the end. And if you step onto the field, you are not allowed to be the worst. The training sessions between father and son were not light moments, but endless repetitions of passes, shots, situations that seemed simple, but had to be executed to perfection. And in the cold afternoons of London, when other children had gone home, Beckham still stayed on the field, continuing to train, not because anyone demanded it, but because deep down, that boy began to believe that if he did not try harder than everyone, he would never be enough. It was in those years that a habit formed, not the habit of a normal child, but the habit of someone who always had to prove himself. Beckham did not just play soccer. He trained with an obsession that even adults could hardly understand, Every shot was not simply an attempt, but a correction. Every mistake, no matter how small, became something unacceptable. And gradually, between the long training sessions, between the repetitions until exhaustion, that boy began to lose something many people do not realize until it is too late. That is the comfort of being allowed to make mistakes. Because in Beckham's world at that time, mistakes were not part of the learning process but a sign of not being good enough. Growing up in such an environment, where love was expressed through expectations and recognition only came when standards were met, Beckham gradually understood that his worth was tied to how well he performed. And from there, a silent fear appeared, not loud, not clear, but always present. The fear that if one day he was not good enough, then everything he had would disappear. The fear that he would not only fail on the field, but also disappoint those who had placed their trust in him. And that very fear made him never stop, never allow himself to rest like others, never accept that he had tried enough. There were evenings when the field lights had gone out, and no one was left. Beckham still stood there alone, repeating movements that no one was watching anymore. No one was judging anymore. But he still continued, because the battle at that point was no longer with others, but with himself, with an inner version that always whispered not enough. And the scariest thing was not that he heard that voice, but that he believed it. Believed that he had to do more, had to be better, had to be more perfect, no matter the cost. Beckham's childhood years did not have great tragedies in the way the world often tells. No sudden shocks or shocking losses, but there was something else, something quieter, longer-lasting, and harder to recognize. That was a child gradually learning never to be allowed to be weak, not because someone said it out loud, but because circumstances had taught him that way. And when a child grows up with the belief that he must always be strong, always perfect, always prove his worth, then at some point, living true to his own emotions becomes a luxury, something he no longer knows how to do. And it was from those days that Beckham's second life began to form, not on the field, not in front of the cameras, but inside the man himself. A life where he had to keep all the doubts, the worries, the pressures that no one saw. A life that he would carry with him for many years afterward, even when the whole world believed he had everything. Because sometimes the hardest thing is not achieving the dream but living with it while never being allowed to collapse. And then, when David Beckham entered the Manchester United Academy, which was considered the dream of thousands of boys across England, he did not step in as someone ready to shine, but as a child carrying the fear that had been nurtured from the years before, the fear that he was not good enough, not fast enough, not strong enough to survive in an environment where everyone around him was excellent in their own way, where every training session was not only an opportunity but also a selection process, where every mistake, no matter how small, could become a reason to be left behind, and where no one really cared how much you had tried, only whether you were good enough or not. Among the young players of his time, Beckham was not the one who made a strong impression right from the start. He did not possess explosive speed that made others notice. He did not have a superior physique to overwhelm opponents. And he was not a natural talent that coaches had to immediately see as a future star. He was just a normal name on a long list of young players trying to find their place. And that very thing made every passing day become a silent battle, a battle that no one but him recognized because it took place in thoughts, in the feeling of being compared, in the moments when other people's eyes passed over without stopping. There were days when Beckham trained until exhausted, but still left the field with the feeling that he had not done enough. There were training sessions where he knew he had tried harder than yesterday, but still received no praise. And there were moments when his name was not mentioned, not because he was bad, but because there were others who stood out more, faster, stronger, and in such an environment. Not being noticed sometimes hurt more than being criticized because it made a person start to wonder if he really existed in other people's eyes or not. The times of being doubted did not come loudly, No one said outright that Beckham was not good enough, but he felt it through the way people perceived him, through the fact that he always had to do more to achieve the same recognition that others could get more easily. And gradually, a dangerous belief began to form, that if he did not try twice, 3 times as hard, then he would disappear, would be replaced, would be forgotten. And that very belief pushed him to the limits of himself, not once, but repeatedly every day. Beckham began arriving at the field earlier than everyone else, and leaving after everyone had gone home. Not because anyone required it, but because he did not allow himself to stop. Every shot was performed hundreds of times. Every pass was repeated to the point of near obsession. And even when his body was tired, when his legs began to feel heavy, he still continued, because in his head there was always a voice that never stopped reminding him that it is still not enough. And the scary thing was not that the voice existed, but that it became a part of him, a part he could not separate. In an environment where only the best survived, Beckham had no choice but to become better every day. But even when he began to progress, when his technique gradually perfected, when his free kicks started to bring results, the feeling of never enough still did not disappear. It only changed form, from the fear of being eliminated to the fear of not being able to reach the top, from the worry of not being chosen to the worry of not being able to maintain his position, and so on. He lived in a state where success did not bring peace of mind but only brought greater pressure. There were moments when, looking around, Beckham saw other players who seemed more confident, more at ease, as if they were living in their own dream, while he still felt like he was trying to deserve it, as if every step forward had to be paid for with doubt and relentless effort. And that made him never truly enjoy what he achieved, because right when he achieved something, he was already thinking about the next thing, the bigger thing, the harder thing, the thing he was not sure he could achieve. It was in those years, when no one was really paying attention, when everything was still ahead, when the name Beckham meant nothing to the world, that a person was formed, not by natural talent, but by endurance, by the ability to continue even when not recognized, by the determination not to let himself be forgotten. And it was also in this period that his second life became clearer than ever. A life where he had to carry the feeling of never being enough, never being complete, never being able to stop. And perhaps the most painful thing was not that he had to try harder than others, but that no matter how much he tried, he still could not convince himself that he was good enough, that he deserved to be here, that he did not need to prove anything more. Because for Beckham, the journey was never about reaching a destination, but a series of long days of trying not to fall behind. A race with no finish line, where the biggest opponent was not those around him, but the inner feeling that he had never been enough. When the opportunity finally came, David Beckham did not step up to Manchester United's first team as a winner, ready to enjoy the fruits, but as someone who had become accustomed to proving himself every day, every minute, every touch of the ball. And that very thing made his first steps on the big stage not at all easy, as many imagined, because behind every match there was not only the opponent, but also the old fear that had never left, the fear that just one mistake and everything he had tried to build would collapse, and someone else would take his place without thinking. But then, right in that pressure, Beckham began to create moments that no one could ignore, passes so accurate they seemed drawn in advance, free kicks carrying unpredictable trajectories, and with each match that passed, his name gradually appeared more. No longer a young player trying to survive, but an indispensable part of a collective stepping into its brightest period. The generation called Class of '92, where names like his together created an era that English soccer would never forget. An era where victory was no longer a distant goal, but something expected. Titles began to come. Each trophy, each championship, each historic moment, especially the 1998 to 1999 season when Manchester United achieved the treble. an accomplishment that even the greatest teams rarely achieve. And in all of that, Beckham was no longer the boy who had once been doubted. He became one of the faces representing success, a new icon of modern soccer, where talent was not only measured by technique, but also by the ability to create moments that made the whole world stop to watch. But along with the fame came something else, something he had never really prepared to face. That was the eyes of the whole world beginning to turn toward him, not only on the field, but in the smallest details of life. From the way he dressed, the way he spoke, to the places he appeared, all became topics for gossip, for analysis, for judgment, and gradually, Beckham realized that he was no longer living a life of his own, but living in a space where everything was seen, recorded, and judged. Training sessions were no longer just places to improve skills, but places with cameras watching. Going out was no longer private moments, but opportunities for the press to look for stories. And even when he did nothing wrong, existing under constant attention was enough to make a person feel tired, because there was nowhere to truly rest, no moment when he could completely be himself without being observed. Beckham's fame did not stop at soccer. He began to become an icon beyond the field, appearing on magazine covers, in advertising campaigns, in the world of fashion, and with each step forward, his image was increasingly shaped in the way the public wanted to see. A perfect image, without cracks, without mistakes, without weakness. And that unintentionally created a gap between the real person and the person the world saw. A gap he had to maintain every day. His personal life began to shrink in a way that even he did not realize right from the beginning. Relationships had to be considered. Actions had to be controlled. Words had to be chosen carefully, because just one careless moment and everything could be misunderstood, exaggerated, turned into a story completely different from reality. And in that world, Beckham no longer had the right to make mistakes like a normal person, because his mistakes were not just personal mistakes, but a public event. There were days when, amid all the success, amid the cheers, amid the titles that any player would dream of, Beckham still felt a void he could not name, not because he was not happy with what he had achieved, but because he began to realize that to have all of that, he had had to trade a part of himself, the part that could live freely, the part that could make mistakes, the part that could be weak without fear of being judged. And it was in this period that his second life was no longer just a vague feeling, but became a clear reality. A life he had to carry every day, where he had to keep everything that did not fit the perfect image the world expected, where he had to keep moving forward even when he was no longer sure what he was moving forward for, and where success was no longer a destination, but became a responsibility he could not abandon. Beckham had achieved what very few people could achieve, but its price was not only sweat on the field, but the silence in moments no one saw. It was having to live between two worlds that were never allowed to touch each other. And when the world looked at him as an unbreakable icon, no one realized that having to keep himself from breaking had become the greatest burden he had to carry. And then the summer of 1998 arrived, a moment when David Beckham stepped onto the field not only as a rising player, but as the hope of an entire nation, where every run of his carried the expectations of millions of people, where the England national team jersey was not only an honor, but also a burden that not everyone could understand. And in the match against Argentina, when the clock was still running, when emotions were rising, a brief moment changed everything. A reflexive action after a collision with Diego Simeone, a light touch of the foot, but enough for the referee to pull out a red card. And in just a few seconds, everything collapsed in a way no one could stop, not because of failure on the field, but because of the way the world chose to view that moment as a symbol of betrayal. When Beckham left the field that day, he did not just leave the match, but stepped into a period that he himself had never been prepared to face, where from a young player full of potential, he became a name mentioned with anger, with disappointment, with criticism that had no end. The press did not talk about what he had done before. They talked about that moment, repeated it, exaggerated it, turned it into a story that the whole of England carried like an obsession. And in the days after that, Beckham was no longer a person. He became a symbol of failure, of mistake, of something the fans could not forgive. Images were burned on the streets. Dolls with his face were hung up as mockery. Newspaper headlines kept repeating his name with heavy words. All created an atmosphere that no one could call fair, but was the reality he had to live in. And the most painful thing was not the words from strangers, but the feeling that an entire country had turned its back, that the place he once called home had now become a place where he was no longer welcomed as before. Beckham's personal life began to be affected in a way he could not control. Letters were no longer words of encouragement, but full of threats. Phone calls were no longer care, but carried hostility. And in a world where everything was exaggerated, the boundary between the field and private life gradually disappeared, leaving him with nowhere to hide, no space to breathe. And even when with family, the feeling of insecurity still did not leave, because what happened on the field had followed him home, seeping into every moment that should have been peaceful. There were days when Beckham did not want to step outside, not because he was afraid to face the world, but because he did not understand why everything had become like this after just one moment, did not understand why all the previous efforts could be erased so easily. And it was in that silence that a feeling of isolation began to grow, not ordinary loneliness, but the feeling of being completely detached from the surrounding world, as if no one saw his real self anymore, but only saw an image they had created themselves. Beckham did not react, did not stand up to explain, did not try to justify. He chose silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that in such a wave, any words could be distorted, and that very silence made everything heavier, because when a person does not protect himself, the world will create the story for him, and that story is rarely something good. In the depths, the fear from childhood returned, stronger than ever, the fear that he was not good enough, that he had disappointed everyone, that everything he had tried to build could collapse in just one moment. And this time it was no longer a fear in a small training field, but a fear in front of the whole world, a world that was looking at him not with expectation but with judgment. And right in that moment, Beckham's second life was no longer a hidden part, but became the only place he could exist, where he kept all the emotions no one was allowed to see, where he faced doubt, pain, the feeling of being misunderstood without being able to share, and where he was forced to find a way to stand firm, not because he did not want to collapse, but because he knew that if he collapsed, there would be no one there to pick him up. It was not just a failure in his career, but a deep cut into the person he was, a memory he would carry for many years afterward, a reminder that the world could love you today and turn its back on you tomorrow, and that to survive in such a world, sometimes the only thing you could do was not to fight, but to endure, to keep moving forward, and to wait for the day when you could rewrite your own story, even if the price to pay was having to live with the feeling of being hated without a chance to explain. After the days when an entire country had turned its back, when David Beckham almost had nowhere left to find peace, his life unexpectedly turned in a different direction, a direction many believed would save him, but at the same time opened up a completely new form of pressure. That was when he met Victoria Beckham, a woman who was also living under the spotlight, also familiar with attention, also understood the feeling of being stared at by millions of unfamiliar eyes, and in a world where everything could be distorted, they found in each other an empathy that needed no explanation, an understanding that came from both of them knowing exactly what the price of fame was. But right from the early days, that relationship was never allowed to develop like a normal story. There were no truly private moments, no dates without being followed, because as soon as news about them appeared, the media immediately turned them into the center of attention, a perfect story to exploit, a combination of soccer and music, between Manchester United and the Spice Girls, between a player trying to stand up after an incident and a pop star already familiar with the spotlight, and in a short time, they were no longer two separate people but became a shared image, an icon that the world gave the name Posh and Bex. From then on, everything in their lives was exposed, from meals, trips, to the most private moments. All could become newspaper headlines. Cameras that never left them, stories written every day, whether true or not. And in such an environment, love was not just an emotion between two people, but became something that had to be protected in front of the whole world. Something that had to exist under pressure that not many relationships could endure. When they got married, instead of enjoying the beginning of a family, Beckham and Victoria stepped into a period where every decision was analyzed, every action was judged, and every small mistake could be exaggerated into a big issue. Not because they did anything wrong, but because they were no longer allowed to live like normal people. They became an image the public wanted to see. A perfect family, a flawless life, a beautiful story that everyone wanted to believe. And that very thing made the pressure not stop at Beckham as an individual, but spread to his entire family. There were times when Beckham realized that becoming a husband, a father in that situation, was not as simple as he had once thought, not because he did not want to, but because the world around him did not give him the chance to do it naturally. Moments that should have been private became public. Personal decisions were influenced by the gaze of others, and gradually the boundary between real life and the life the public saw began to blur to the point it was hard to distinguish. Victoria, with all her strength, became an important support, but even she could not stop the pressure from outside, because both of them were caught in a vortex that no one could fully control. A vortex where they had to maintain their relationship, maintain their image, and face stories that kept appearing. And in all of that, Beckham began to feel more clearly than ever that his second life was no longer just personal pressures, but had spread to his entire life. Private life almost no longer existed in the way people understood. There were no completely quiet days, no moments when he could separate himself from the world, because even at home, even with family, the feeling of being watched was always present, like a shadow that never disappeared and that made even the simplest things become a luxury, like being able to live without anyone looking, being able to make mistakes without being judged, being himself without having to think about the consequences. Beckham began to understand that his love not only needed sincerity, but also needed endurance. Not only needed connection, but also needed sacrifice. Because in such a world, keeping a relationship was not something obvious, but a continuous process of protecting, of standing firm against things that could break it. And while the world looked at them as a perfect couple, no one really knew how much they had to try to keep it that way. There were nights when everything became quiet, when the lights had gone out and there was no noise from outside. Beckham still felt a pressure he could not share, a feeling that he was living a life he did not fully control, a life where he had to balance between being himself and becoming the person the world expected. And that very tension made him realize that even in love, even in family, he still could not completely escape the second life he had carried for so long. And perhaps what made everything more difficult was not that they were being followed, but that they had to learn to live with it, had to accept that their life would always be different, would always be affected by factors they could not control. And in all of that, Beckham was not only trying to maintain his career, but also trying to hold on to the only thing that could give him a sense of peace. That was family, even if the price to pay was that he almost no longer had a truly private life anymore. The deeper he advanced into the peak of fame, David Beckham gradually realized that success was not an ending point, but the beginning of another form of imprisonment. A space without iron bars but tighter than any prison, where everything he did, from runs on the field to the way he tied his shoelaces, from the clothes he chose to wear to the way he stood next to his family, was seen, analyzed, judged. And in such a world, Living became a series of decisions that had to be considered to perfection, because just one loose moment and the image he had built could crack immediately. Beckham was no longer just a player. He became a global brand, a model to be copied, an icon of fashion, style, and success. Advertising campaigns, big contracts, long photo shoots, all opened up before him like a reward for previous efforts, but at the same time also brought a responsibility that no one could share. The responsibility to always appear the right way, to always say the right thing, to always be the best version of himself in the eyes of the public, and that gradually turned things that were naturally into things that were calculated. There were days when Beckham woke up and knew that he was not just a person but an image that needed to be maintained, a role he could not leave, even when there were no cameras, because, in an era when paparazzi could appear anywhere, there was no clear boundary between when he was working and when he was living, between the real person and the person the world wanted to see, and that very thing made him gradually lose the ability to distinguish which were his own choices and which were choices made to fit the image he had to protect. The habit of control began to form not as a choice but as a defense mechanism. Beckham began to pay attention to the smallest details, from the way things were arranged, the way everything had to be neat and symmetrical, to the way he prepared for every public appearance. Not because he wanted to become elaborate, but because he no longer believed he could let things happen naturally without being judged. And gradually, control no longer stopped at actions, but spread into thoughts, into the way he saw himself, into the way he evaluated everything he did. Every step outside carried a light tension that no one could see, a feeling that he was being watched even when he could not see the cameras, that any mistake could be recorded and spread. And in that state, the body could continue to function, could continue to play, could continue to appear in front of thousands of people. But inside, fatigue began to accumulate. Not the fatigue of muscles, but the fatigue of always having to maintain a perfect version of himself. Beckham never talked much about it. There were no public complaints, no moments when he allowed himself to collapse in front of the cameras, because he understood that his image did not allow that to happen, that millions of people were looking at him as an icon of control, of strength, and if he allowed himself to weaken, that image would collapse. And that was why he continued to stay silent, continued to appear with a smile, continued to fulfill the role he had been placed in, even though, inside, exhaustion was gradually becoming a familiar part. The rare moments alone were no longer real rest, because even when there was no one around, thoughts still continued to run. Questions still appeared, whether he had done enough, whether he was maintaining the image everyone expected, whether there was anything he had missed that could become a problem later. And in such a state, finding peace became more difficult than ever, because peace did not only come from having no external pressure, but also from having no internal pressure, something Beckham had never truly had. Family, even though it remained a support, could not completely separate him from that pressure, because family itself was also part of the image he had to protect, something the world looked at to judge him not only as a player but as a person. And that made the responsibility even heavier, not only keeping his career solid, but also keeping a life that many believed was perfect, even though reality was never that simple. The more successful he became, the more Beckham realized he was living in a loop with no way out, where every step forward brought even greater pressure, where every achievement did not bring release but only raised the standard he had to meet. And in all of that, his second life became clearer than ever, a life where he had to carry everything he could not show, where he had to keep moving forward even when he was no longer sure how much strength he had left to maintain that pace. And perhaps what made everything the heaviest was not that he had to be perfect in front of others, but that he began to believe he had to be that way, that if he was not perfect, he would lose everything, and that very belief turned his life into a prison with no door, where he was both the prisoner and the one holding the key, but he never dared to open it, because he was not sure what would happen if he stepped out and let the world see the real person. Imperfect, not in control, no longer the image they had been familiar with for many years, when the pressure from fame had not yet had time to settle. Another crack began to form in the place that David Beckham once believed was the most solid, the place that had nurtured him from the very first days, the place where he had grown up, won and built his name. That was Manchester United, and especially the relationship with the man who had once played the role of a second father in his career, Alex Ferguson, a man who not only coached but also shaped the person Beckham was, but who was also the one from whom he gradually became distant in a way that neither could return to as before. At first, it was not a clear breakdown. There were no public statements or direct confrontations in front of the cameras, but a silent change, a gap that grew larger and larger between two people who once understood each other very well. Ferguson saw in Beckham no longer just a player completely focused on soccer, but an icon being pulled away from the field by outside factors, by advertising, by fashion, by a life that he believed was distracting his focus, while Beckham, on the other side, did not feel he was losing dedication, but was only trying to survive in a world that had changed too fast around him. The looks in the locker room were no longer the same as before. The conversations no longer carried the closeness of the early years, and gradually, trust began to be replaced by doubt, not because Beckham was no longer trying, but because the way he was perceived had changed. From a player full of hunger to an image that others were no longer sure belonged on the field anymore. And in an environment where focus was everything, any sign of distraction became a big problem. Then that moment happened. An incident in the locker room after a match, when emotions ran high, when words were no longer controlled as before, and in a situation no one could predict. A boot flew from Ferguson's foot and accidentally hit Beckham, leaving a cut on his face, a small physical wound but carrying much greater meaning, because it was not just an accident, but a symbol of the rift that had silently existed before, a sign that the once very strong relationship was no longer the same. After that incident, everything could not go back. Not because both did not want to, but because what had happened had changed the way they looked at each other. Ferguson no longer saw Beckham as an indispensable part of the team. And Beckham also began to realize that the place he once called home might no longer have room for him. And in that situation, leaving was no longer a distant option but became something inevitable. The decision to leave Manchester United did not come in a single moment, but was the result of many days, many weeks, many months of accumulated emotions that could not be resolved. And when it finally happened, when Beckham officially left the club he had been attached to since his teenage years, it was not just a career move, but a profound loss that no one could see fully. Because for him, Manchester United was not just a workplace, but the place where he had laid the foundation for his entire life. Some people leave a club to seek new challenges. But for Beckham, the departure carried a different feeling. A feeling like being separated from a part of himself, as if he was leaving the only place he had ever truly belonged. And even though a big opportunity at Real Madrid lay ahead, even though it was one of the most prestigious teams in the world, that could not erase the empty feeling he carried when he left. In the early days in the new environment, among big names, amid the bright lights, Beckham still carried a part of the past, a part that could not be replaced, and that very thing made him realize that not every step forward brought relief, that sometimes to move forward a person had to accept losing something he could never get back, and in his case, that was the feeling of belonging, the feeling of being in a place where he did not need to prove who he was. This turning point not only changed Beckham's career path, but also reshaped the way he looked at the world around him, at relationships, at trust, and at himself. Because, for the first time, he had to face losing a support he once thought would always be there. And in that process, he understood that his second life did not only exist in pressure or control, but also in the losses he could not share, the feelings he had to face alone without anyone truly understanding. And perhaps what made everything the hardest to accept was not that he had to leave, but that he had no chance to keep what had once been a part of him, no way to go back to the days when everything was still simple, still clear, still belonging to one single place. Because when that door closed, it not only closed a chapter in his career, but also closed a part of the person he was, leaving behind a void that no matter how many future successes could not completely fill. When David Beckham set foot at Real Madrid, the world did not see a person who had just left the place he once called home, but only saw a blockbuster transfer, a perfect piece added to the Galacticos squad, where the brightest names in soccer of that era gathered, where the lights of the Santiago Bernabeu Stadium not only illuminated the players but also magnified everything they did. And in that moment Beckham seemed to have reached a peak that anyone would dream of, wearing the prestigious white jersey, standing next to top superstars, becoming part of a collective whose fame went far beyond the field. But behind those glittering images, a different feeling began to form. Slowly but clearly, a feeling that Beckham could not name immediately, because everything around him said he was in the right place at the right time, living the dream of millions of people, but deep inside, there was a void he could not fill. A void coming from the fact that he no longer felt he belonged here in the way he had once felt at Manchester. In Madrid, Beckham was not just a player. He was a global icon placed into a system that was already in place, where everything had been shaped before he arrived, where each person had a clear role, and in that environment, finding his place was not only a tactical issue, but also an emotional one. Because he did not come as someone nurtured from within, but as someone brought in from outside, an addition that not everyone understood or fully accepted. There were moments on the field when he made accurate passes, when he contributed to victories, when his name was chanted. But even in those times, the feeling of connection still did not come, not because he did not try, but because the connection he once had could not be recreated in a new environment, where everything operated at a different rhythm, where relationships had already been built before, and where he had to find his own way to fit in without the foundation he had before. Outside the field, everything was even clearer. Beckham was perceived not only as a player, but as a commercial machine. A face that could sell jerseys, attract sponsors, expand the club's influence globally. And even though that did not reduce his professional value, it created a distance he could not control, because there were people who looked at him not through what he did on the field, but through what he represented outside. And in such a world, being truly understood became a rare thing. Training sessions, matches, trips, all continued. But inside, Beckham began to feel more clearly the loneliness he had carried from before. A loneliness that did not come from having no one around, but from having no one who really understood what he was going through. Because from the outside, everything still looked perfect. He was still playing, still succeeding, still one of the biggest names in the world, and that very perfection made the loneliness harder to share. Because no one thought that someone who had everything could feel lacking. There were nights when leaving the field, when the lights had gone out, when the noise gradually died down, Beckham returned to himself, to thoughts he could not speak, to the feeling that he was living a life where everything was right but not completely his own, and in those moments, he realized that achieving everything did not mean finding where he belonged, that fame could not replace the feeling of being understood, and that success could not erase loneliness if it did not come with real connection. The distance from teammates was not always clear. There were no big conflicts, no public contradictions, but it still existed, like an invisible layer of air he could not completely break, because each person had their own world, and Beckham, with everything he carried from the past, with everything he represented in the present, became someone standing in between, not completely belonging to the old place, but not yet truly blending into the new one. In those years, Beckham's second life continued to grow, no longer just a place where he hid the pressure, but became a place where he kept the feeling of loneliness that no one saw, a place where he faced questions he could not answer, that if this was the peak, Why did he still feel like he was searching for something? And whether there was somewhere he could truly belong? Not as an icon, not as a brand, but simply as a human being. And perhaps the hardest thing was not living in the loneliness, but having to do it while the whole world believed he was living the perfect dream. That he had no reason to feel that way. That everything in his life had reached a level others could only imagine. And that very difference between what the world saw and what he felt created a gap he had to carry every day, a gap that no titles, no lights, and no cheers could fill. Amid the lingering loneliness, 2004 appeared like a violent wave that David Beckham could not foresee, when rumors of him having an extramarital relationship suddenly flooded the newspapers. Not small rumors that could quietly disappear, but a wave of information spreading at dizzying speed. Repeated, analyzed, exaggerated in every detail. And in a very short time that story was no longer a personal matter, but became a global event, where the name Beckham was no longer associated with free kicks or titles, but with suspicions, questions, and judgments from all sides. No one knew exactly what was true in everything that was written, but in a world where information was consumed faster than verification, that no longer seemed to matter, because for the public the story had already been shaped, and Beckham once again became the center of attention in a way he never wanted. This time, not because of a moment on the field, but because of something that touched the deepest part of his personal life, his family, the place he once thought was the last safe zone left. His family, with Victoria Beckham, was no longer just a support, but became the center of the storm. Every glance, every gesture, every appearance, together or separately, was dissected, speculated on, linked to stories they could not control. And in that atmosphere, keeping calm was already difficult, let alone maintaining a relationship that had already endured pressure for many years. There were days when Beckham woke up and saw his story on every newspaper page, on every television channel, as if there was nowhere left to hide, no space he could step into without being mentioned. And that made the feeling of losing control clearer than ever, because this time he could not solve it by playing better, could not answer with a performance on the field, but had to face a problem with no clear solution. The pressure came not only from outside but also from inside, from his own thoughts, from the fear that he might lose what was most important, not titles, not his career, but his family, the things he had tried to protect for so many years. And for the first time, the possibility of losing everything became so real that he could not ignore it, could not reassure himself that everything would be okay, because in a world where public opinion could change very quickly, no one could be sure what would happen next. The media did not stop. Every day there were new stories, new details, new accounts, creating an endless loop where the story never really closed but was always prolonged, renewed, brought back like a wound that was never allowed to heal. And in that vortex, Beckham and his family had to learn to survive, not by controlling the story, but by enduring it. Victoria, with all her strength, did not leave, did not let what happened break the family. But that did not mean everything was unaffected, because trust, no matter how strong, could not be completely immune to what was happening around them. And it was in this period that both had to face questions they had never had to answer before, not only about their relationship, but about how they would continue together through a world that kept challenging them. Beckham, as he had done many times before, chose silence, not because he did not want to speak, but because he understood that any words could be interpreted differently, and in such a situation sometimes speaking out did not help solve the problem, but only made it more complicated. But that silence also carried a price, because when a person did not speak up, the story would be told by others, and it was rarely the story they wanted. The matches continued, the career went on, but behind it was another battle. A battle with no audience, no scoreboard, no final whistle, where Beckham had to face what could not be seen, with the feeling of being judged without a chance to defend himself, with the worry that everything he had built could collapse, not because he did not play well, but because of a story he could not control. And perhaps what made everything the heaviest was not that he was suspected, but that he knew that no matter what the truth was, his image in the eyes of many people had changed, that a part of the trust had been lost, and regaining it was not something that could be done overnight, if it could be done at all. And that very thing made the future more uncertain than ever. In all the years that had passed, Beckham had faced many pressures, many incidents, but never before had he stood before the risk of losing both his family and his reputation at the same time, like this. And that very moment marked one of the greatest challenges in his life, not on the field but in life itself, where he had to find a way to keep what was most important while everything around him seemed to be slipping out of his hands, and where he was forced to face a question that no one could answer for him, that who he would be if he lost everything that had defined him for so many years. After all the noise, when every explanation carried the risk of being distorted and every word could become a new headline, David Beckham chose a path that not everyone had the courage to take. That was silence, not avoidance, but a conscious decision, a way of self-protection in a world where words no longer belonged to the speaker, where any reaction could be prolonged and distorted into another story. And in that silence, he did not try to change what others thought, but focused on the only thing he could still control. That was his own actions. The days after that were not easier, because silence did not make the storm disappear. It only made him face it in a different way, with no chance to argue back, no way to explain, only continuing to live while the story continued outside. And in that situation, Beckham poured all his energy into the two things he believed were most important: family and career, not as two separate parts, but as the only two pillars that could keep him standing firm. In the family, he was no longer an icon, no longer the public image, but a husband, a father trying to keep what could be lost, and that demanded more than any match he had ever played, because there was no clear tactic, no coach to guide, only patience, presence, and a non-stop effort to prove that what existed between him and Victoria Beckham could not be defined by what others said. Victoria did not leave, but that did not mean everything was not hurt, because trust, once challenged, needed time to be rebuilt. And Beckham understood that he could not demand it happen quickly, could not force everything back to the way it was before. He could only be there, every day, repeating small actions, quiet gestures, efforts that no one outside the family saw. And it was in those seemingly simple things that he began to rebuild a foundation he once thought could not be shaken. On the field, Beckham continued to play, not as a way to escape, but as a way to keep the only part of life he could still control, where the result depended on effort, where he could answer with actions instead of words. And even though every run still carried pressure, even though every match was still viewed through the lens of what was happening off the field, he still continued, because stopping was not an option. But inside, the battle never really stopped. The feeling of guilt, though not always clear, still existed like a shadow, not always appearing, but always there, seeping into quiet moments, into times when he was alone, into seconds when he could not stay busy to forget. And that very feeling made him try even harder, not to prove to the world, but to convince himself that he could still keep what was important. The pressure did not disappear. It only changed form, from external pressure to internal pressure, from public criticism to questions he asked himself. And in such a state, continuing to stand firm was not something obvious, but the result of a persistent process no one saw. A process where every passing day was a small step toward the stability he was trying to rebuild. There were times when Beckham realized that his silence was not a sign of weakness, but a different form of strength. A strength that did not need to be shown outwardly, did not need to be recognized, but was enough to help him go through a period that many people might have collapsed in. And that very silence became the only shield between him and a world that kept trying to pull him into its vortex. Family gradually became the center of every decision, not because he wanted to withdraw from the world, but because he understood that if he lost that, everything else would no longer have meaning. And in that process, Beckham not only tried to maintain his relationship, but also learned to see again the value of what he had, not through the eyes of the public, but through the small moments that only those closest to him understood. His second life still existed, still carried the pressures, the doubts, the emotions he could not share. But in this period, it was no longer just a place where he hid the pain, but became a place where he learned to endure it, not so that it would disappear, but so that it no longer controlled him as before. And that was a slow process with no clear ending, but the only path he could take. And perhaps the most remarkable thing was not how Beckham had overcome this period, but the way he did it, not with big statements, not with attention-grabbing actions, but with quiet persistence. By continuing to live, continuing to try, continuing to hold on to what was most important even when everything around him seemed to be against him. And it was in that persistence that he not only protected his personal life, but also kept a part of the person he had almost lost. In those years when the waves of the past were still simmering and life gradually regained its fragile rhythm, David Beckham once again made a decision that many people could not understand, a move that from the outside looked like a retreat, like a sign that he was moving away from the peak, that was transferring to LA Galaxy, a league that at that time was not yet seen as a destination for players still capable of competing at the highest level. And immediately questions began to appear, not about what he could do, but about why he chose this path. Why someone who had once played on the biggest stages accepted stepping into an environment considered lower. The doubts came not only from fans, but also from experts, from those who had followed his career and could not understand this decision. They talked about him choosing money over glory, said that he was exploiting his image in a new market, that he no longer had the hunger to continue fighting in Europe, and in all those comments, very few people saw what Beckham was really facing, a person who was not only looking for success, but looking for a way to continue existing without losing himself. Leaving Europe was not an easy move, not only because of the professional aspect, but because it meant he had to start over in a completely different environment, where everything from the way soccer was played, the sports culture to the way people perceived soccer was different. And in the first days in the United States, Beckham was not welcomed as a hero, but as an unanswered question, a person many believed came only to create attention rather than to create real change. The first matches did not bring immediate answers. His body was no longer at its peak as before. Injuries began to appear more often, and in an environment where he had to adapt to everything from the beginning, finding his rhythm again became more difficult. The criticisms did not decrease but increased. Every mistake was seen as proof that he had made the wrong decision. Every match that did not meet expectations became a reason to reinforce the belief that he had entered the final phase of his career. But Beckham did not react in the way many expected. He did not try to prove it with words, did not argue with outside opinions. He continued doing what he had been used to throughout his life, working, adapting, and persisting. Every training session, every match, every small step to understand the new environment, to find the feeling of playing again, to prove not to others but to himself that he could still move forward, even though the path was no longer the same as before. In a place where soccer was not yet the center, Beckham gradually realized that his role did not stop at playing but also at bringing something the league was still lacking: attention, trust, and an image that could bring development. And even though that was not what he had dreamed of when he was a boy in London, he accepted it as part of the journey, a part of the life he did not completely choose but had to learn to live with. The years in the United States were not always easy. There were periods when he had to face opposition from the team's own fans, times when his presence was questioned. But instead of withdrawing, Beckham continued, little by little, rebuilding trust, not with promises, but with his presence, with the fact that he kept showing up on the field, kept contributing, kept showing that he was not there just to exist, but to contribute. Gradually, what he did began to create change. Not immediately, not in a loud way, but like a slow but persistent flow. Stadiums began to have more spectators, interest in the league increased, and Beckham's role in that process became clearer, not just as a player, but as a bridge between two worlds, between European soccer and a developing market, between his past and a future he helped build. And in all of that, Beckham's second life was still there. But this time it was not just a place where he hid the pressure, but became a place where he found a different kind of meaning. Not about becoming the best, but about creating something beyond himself. A legacy not only tied to titles, but to the change he left behind. Even though at first no one believed it could happen. Perhaps what made this decision special was not that he left, but the way he faced what followed. The skepticism, the criticism, the difficulties in adapting, and the fact that he did not give up even when things did not go as expected. Because in a world where many people only looked at results, Beckham chose a path whose value could not be measured immediately, and that very thing made this seemingly failing move become an important part of his story. And when looking back, it can be seen that this was not an ending but a transition, a period when Beckham no longer only fought to keep his position but to redefine the path he wanted to take, even if that meant accepting being misunderstood once again, because for him, being misunderstood had never been something new. But continuing to move forward despite it was what had shaped the person he was throughout many years. When the years in the United States gradually stabilized and the doubts began to settle, David Beckham once again chose a path that was not easy, a path that brought him back to Europe for short periods, wearing the AC Milan jersey, not to regain the lost spotlight, but to prove to himself that he could still play at the highest level, that what he had built was not just an image but real ability that still existed, even though time had begun to leave marks on his body. But it was in those efforts that an undeniable reality gradually became clear. His body no longer responded as before. Injuries appeared more often and lasted longer, and every return to the field came with a trade-off that only those inside truly understood. Training sessions no longer brought the light feeling of the early years. Every run required more effort, every touch demanded more careful calculation, not because the technique had been lost, but because the body no longer allowed the same freedom as before. And in a sport where speed and endurance played an important role, realizing that he was no longer at the peak was not a single moment, but a prolonged process. A process where every passing day brought a small signal that time was moving forward, whether he was ready or not. But if the body gradually slowed down, then Beckham's spirit did not change in that way. He still stepped onto the field with the same focus, the same competitive hunger, the same desire to contribute, not because he needed to prove it to the world, but because it had become a part of who he was, a part that could not be separated, and that very thing made him continue, even though he knew that every match could be a bigger challenge than before. Not only against opponents, but against his own limits. There were matches where he was no longer the center, no longer the one deciding the outcome as before. But he was still there, still passing the ball, still moving, still finding ways to make a difference in the way he could, and in those moments a silent change took place, from being the leader to becoming the supporter, from being the icon of explosion to the icon of resilience. And even though that was not always noticed, it reflected a maturity that not everyone could achieve. When he moved to Paris Saint-Germain, Beckham entered the final chapter of his career, a chapter that no longer carried the pressure to prove anything, but was an opportunity to end the journey in the way he felt was right, in an environment that still had high competitiveness, but also enough space for him to enjoy what was left. And even though his playing time was not long, every time he stepped onto the field carried a different meaning. Not to build more fame, but to close a story that had lasted for many years. In this period, Beckham began to look back at the path he had taken, not with regret, but with a gradually forming acceptance. Acceptance that no one could stay at the peak forever, that every journey had an ending point, and that the value of a career lay not only in what was achieved, but also in the way a person left it. And for him, leaving was not a failure, but a natural part of the life he had spent so many years pursuing. The injuries, the physical limits, the moments when the body no longer responded as desired, all gradually led him to a decision that, although it had been predicted before, was still not easy to accept. The decision to end his playing career, not in an explosive moment, but in silence, in the way many things in his life had happened, not loud, not dramatic, but carrying a weight that only he could fully feel. When he officially stepped away from the field, Beckham was not only leaving a profession, but leaving a large part of himself. A part that had shaped him since he was a boy, a part that had brought him everything the world saw, and also the part that had brought the pressures he had carried for many years. And in that moment, between the end and the beginning, there was a silence with no cheers, no lights, only a person standing still and looking back at the journey that had passed. But even when his playing career closed, the inner battle did not disappear, because the second life he had carried for so many years did not depend on whether he was still playing or not. It was still there, still existing as a part of who he was, and perhaps the biggest challenge at this point was not continuing to compete on the field, but learning to live without it, learning to exist in a world where he no longer had to prove himself through every match, but still had to face what had been formed throughout that journey. And it was in this period that Beckham began to step into another challenge, not as a player, but as a person, looking for a way to continue living after the biggest chapter of his life had closed. A journey with no coach, no tactic, only time, and what he had learned from all the years that had passed. The years that had made him become the person the world knew, and also the person that not everyone truly understood. When the final whistle of his playing career had closed, David Beckham stepped into a void that he had not truly experienced before. A life with no more packed match schedules, no more long training sessions, no more pressure to step onto the field and prove himself every day. And at first glance, that looked like the release that any player would look forward to after many years of tension. But for Beckham, that quietness brought a different feeling, a feeling of emptiness that he had to learn to face, because when a very large part of life suddenly disappeared, finding the rhythm again was not an easy thing. In the early days after retirement, there was no noise like the years before. There were no more big headlines about form or match results, but Beckham was still not completely separated from the public eye. Only the way he appeared had changed, from a player to a person reshaping his role, no longer running on the field, but standing on the outside, observing, thinking, and step by step building a new path, a path where he could continue to be connected to soccer, but in a different way. Becoming a businessman did not come as a random choice, but was the result of many years of thinking, of accumulated experiences, and especially of the desire to create something more lasting than matches, and that very thing led him to co-owning Inter Miami CF, a project that was not only personal but also reflected his belief in the development of soccer in the United States, a place where he had once set foot during the years of doubt. And now he returned not as a player, but as someone contributing to building the future. But even with a new goal, Beckham's life still needed time to adapt, because leaving the field was not just a change of job, but a change in the way he saw himself, from a person always measured by achievements to a person who had to find value in other things. And in that process, there were moments when he had to relearn things that seemed simple, like living without having to prepare for the next match, without having to keep his body in the highest state of readiness, without having to think about opponents. Family gradually became the center of life in a way that before he did not have enough time to feel. Meals were no longer interrupted by schedules. Evenings no longer had to end early to prepare for the next day. Moments with his wife and children were no longer divided by continuous trips, and in that change, Beckham began to find a different kind of peace. Not the excitement of victory, but the stability of being with the most important people. However, spending more time with family did not mean everything became completely easy, because what he had gone through throughout his career was still there, still affecting the way he thought, the way he reacted, and sometimes the silence he had learned to keep for many years did not easily disappear. It became a part of who he was, a part that he had to gradually understand and accept rather than try to eliminate. The slower pace of life brought the opportunity for Beckham to look back, not only at the successes, but also at what he had had to trade. And in those moments, he began to realize that the second life he had once carried did not disappear when he left the field. It only changed form, from the pressure of playing to deeper thoughts about himself, about what he wanted to keep and what he could let go. There were days when he woke up with no specific schedule, no clear goal for each hour as before, and that at first brought a strange feeling, as if he was standing in a space with no direction. But gradually, he learned to accept that uncertainty, learned to let things happen more naturally, learned not to control every detail as before, even though that was not always easy for a person who had been used to controlling almost everything in life. Building Inter Miami became an important part of the adaptation process, not only because it kept him connected to soccer, but because it gave him a new goal, something to aim for, a way to continue contributing without having to be on the field. And in that journey, Beckham was no longer just an individual, but became a leader, a person creating opportunities for future generations. A different role, but still carrying the spirit he had had from the early days. And perhaps the most important thing in this period was not what Beckham achieved, but the way he learned to live without having to prove himself every day. A lesson he did not have the chance to learn while still playing. A lesson about accepting that his value did not only lie in what he did, but in who he was when the lights were no longer shining on him. In that quietness, not completely absolute, not completely uninterrupted, but enough for him to feel, Beckham began to find a balance he had lacked for many years. Not perfection, but acceptance. Not controlling everything, but allowing himself to live without having to meet every expectation. And it was in that change that he stepped into a new chapter, no longer a player, no longer an icon in the old way, but a person learning to exist in a life where the noise had gradually settled down. When everything gradually settled and life was no longer swept away by the rhythm of the field, David Beckham was probably the one who understood most clearly that his journey had never been as simple as what the world had once seen. Because if looking back from the very first days in London, from the boy standing alone on the training field with the fear of not being good enough, to the man stepping through peaks and incidents that few could imagine, everything was not a straight line of success, but a series of challenges following one another. Moments when he had to choose to continue or stop, and throughout that journey there was one thing that had never changed. That was the existence of two parallel lives that he could not separate. One life that the world saw, where he was the icon of perfection, of discipline, of success, where every title, every shot, every appearance was recorded and honored. And another life, existing in silence, where he had to face the fears that had followed him since he was a child, with the feeling of never being enough, with the pressure that kept increasing with every step forward, with moments he could not share even if he wanted to, because the image he carried on his shoulders did not allow that to happen. The incidents in his life did not always come loudly, but each incident left a deep mark. From the World Cup 1998, when he was turned away by an entire country, to the tense years in the relationship with Alex Ferguson leading to leaving Manchester United, from the feeling of being lost amid the spotlight at Real Madrid, to the media storm in 2004 that almost destroyed the family with Victoria Beckham, and then the doubts when he moved to the United States. All of those were not just separate events, but pieces that made up the person he became. A person shaped not only by victories, but by the way he faced what could break him. In all of that, family gradually became the center around which everything revolved, not because he no longer had passion for soccer, but because he understood that there were things more important than any title, and keeping the family, keeping the relationship with Victoria Beckham, was not something that happened naturally, but the result of persistence, of choices that were not easy, of putting what was most important above everything that could distract him. Beckham never talked much about what he had gone through, did not recount the details of the difficult moments, did not turn his story into a long explanation. But that very silence said more than any words, because it showed the way he chose to face life, not by displaying, but by continuing to move forward even when no one saw everything he carried. Beckham's legacy, if only looked at from the outside, could be measured by titles, numbers, records, marks he left in soccer history. But if looked deeper, what really remained was not only what he had achieved, but the way he had achieved them, the way he had stood firm when criticized, the way he had continued when doubted, the way he had kept what was most important when everything around could collapse. There were people who reached the peak and lost themselves on that path. But Beckham, even though he had to pay with many things, still kept a part of the person he started as, not perfect, not completely unscathed, but enough to continue. Enough not to completely lose himself in a world that always demanded more than what one person could give. And perhaps what made his story different was not that he had succeeded, but that he had done it while carrying a second life that no one really saw. A life where he had to endure, had to stay silent, had to keep what could not be said, and that very thing created a form of strength that not everyone could understand, a strength that did not come from never stumbling, but from not letting the stumbles define him. When looking back, Beckham was not just a player, not just an icon, but a proof of how far a person could go when they did not allow themselves to stop, even when they were not sure they still had enough strength to continue. And in all that he had gone through, perhaps the most important thing was not what he had achieved, but the fact that he was still here, still standing firm, still keeping what really mattered. Because in the end, David Beckham's life was not the story of a person who had never collapsed, but the story of a person who had many times stood at that edge, but always chose to continue, even though he had to live with two parallel lives that he could never completely escape. And it was in that he not only became a soccer legend, but also became a person whose story would continue to be told, not because of perfection, but because of the persistence and the ability to endure that he had carried throughout his entire life. The story of David Beckham is not only the journey of a soccer icon, but a heartbreaking proof of the price of perfection in a society that always demands people to be strong non-stop. From the boy in London carrying the fear of not being good enough, to the moment when the whole of England turned its back after the World Cup 1998, then the shock of leaving Manchester United after the conflict with Alex Ferguson, and the peak being the scandal in 2004 that almost destroyed the family with Victoria Beckham, all show a person who was always placed in situations where he was not allowed to be weak. What makes people heartbroken is not that he stumbled, but that he had to silently endure those wounds while still maintaining the perfect image in front of the public. Even when reaching the peak at Real Madrid or helping change soccer in the United States at LA Galaxy, he still carried the feeling of loneliness and being lost, a detail that shows success never equals inner peace. For the American audience, this story clearly reflects a familiar reality. Society honors success but rarely understands the price behind it. The lesson here is not in becoming perfect, but in the ability to hold on to core values, family, persistence, and honesty with oneself, even when the world around keeps changing. Beckham is not remembered only for the titles, but for the way he stood firm when everything could collapse. And that is exactly what anyone in real life can learn. Real strength does not lie in never collapsing, but in still continuing to move forward when no one sees what you are enduring. If the story of David Beckham has touched you, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a quiet way to honor a person who has endured more than what the world has ever seen. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the stories behind the spotlight that not everyone has the courage to tell.